So first, I want to continue by describing what I'm chairing the WHO committee that's writing this report. I want to describe a little bit about what we plan to cover in our concept note. I'm not going to get too deeply into this. The first task, of course, is to define what a platform trial is. I put the word adaptive in parentheses there because it's supposed to be about adaptive platform trials. I'm a big fan of parsimony. If we don't need the word adaptive there, we can kick it out. So okay, so the next task, I think, we sort of envision there being kind of three clumps of overlapping problems we're going to try to address. The first have to do with scientific integrity issues and range of things that have come up in discussions here so far as well. What kinds of novel validity threats and what kinds of conditions need to be in place in order to address those validity threats when you're implementing platform studies. Also of relevance, different populations are going to bear the risks and benefits of different validity threats or the benefits of procedures that introduce validity threats. I think it's important to kind of map out who is bearing those costs in this context. Obviously, there's statistical analysis of validity issues. So again, establishing conditions that need to be met to go forward. Transparency, not merely about reporting of the results, but also about the methodology. Oftentimes, it can be very difficult for someone to read a platform trial, a publication from a platform trial, and really figure out exactly what was going on, especially as these get into elaborate Bayesian designs where there's borrowing and all sorts of other assumptions that are embedded into the analysis. And then, of course, there's the interpretation and accessibility issues. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later in the talk. Second cluster of issues have to do with the terms for initiating, terminating platform studies and the governance while they are running. These have to do with material conditions that we want to explore. So what material circumstances in terms of budgets need to be in place before you launch a study. Governance structures need to be in place that are going to oversee adding, conduct analysis, adding arms, whatnot. How one engages with host communities. Often, if these are multi-centric studies, there'll be diverse host communities. Their views need to be incorporated into not only the entire platform, but also the component of the platform that they are involved in. And then there's also going to be we're going to need to address issues about how data monitoring and ethics oversight IRBs are going to have to be altered in order to be able to handle this sort of novel and challenging approach. And then getting deeper into that, the third cluster of issues are some of the ethical issues and data monitoring issues. Very specifically, do we need to make modifications to consent for platform studies, or can we just use the standard principles or the standard methods that are used? Does the concept of risk-benefit that's traditionally used to judge whether a clinical trial is ethical, does that hold for platform trials where you're talking about groups of trials and where the risk and benefit can be spread across lots of different activities as opposed to a single hypothesis? Another big challenge is with platform studies, you want to standardize, data are interoperable. This may, again, introduce challenges in terms of local host sites. And then, of course, there's issues about post-trial access and responsiveness. So this gives you a sense of what we're thinking about for the scope. Surely this will undergo modification. Some of these will get collapsed, cut out, et cetera, as we discover they're not particularly interesting. And I welcome any input from anyone here about items that you think are not covered, or perhaps a more logical or coherent way to structure what this report's going to be about. Part two of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about some of my thoughts about platform trials and some of the ethical challenges. And I want to start by bringing up this word, efficiency. I noticed in the word gram exercise, it was the biggest word that came up when people talked about the advantage, efficiency. And if you dig into the literature and find the various paeans that are out there in the literature to platform studies, you'll see that they very prominently identify efficiency as one of the reasons why we ought to explore this. What could efficiency possibly mean? It's actually a almost meaningless term until we begin to describe what we mean by it. And I put this picture up here just to kind of illustrate just the different ways that efficiency can be interpreted. So I think that really one of the tasks in thinking through the ethics of platform studies is, as I'm going to say later, recognizing, as engineers do, that there are many different ways to measure or operationalize efficiency. these different ways are sort of touching on different things that might matter. Some of these things directly are moral, some of them are not moral, some of them perhaps are commercial. But I think having sort of a clear vocabulary of efficiency so that we're not all talking about something different when we extol one method as being more efficient or not, I think that's going to bring a lot more precision to the way we go about trying to design, implement, and interpret studies. I'm going to give you some preliminary thoughts about that. It's based on a book that I'm writing right now about the ethics of drug development. The book is not about platform studies, but I think a lot of what I write in there is very applicable to platform studies. So in drug development, when we talk about efficiency, when most people talk about efficiency, what they have in mind, a mental model of what they have in mind looks something like this. Drug development, it's so inefficient. We put 100 drugs into this black box. Only 5 of them turn out to be safe, and effective. How can we make that more efficient? Get that number 100 down. Another way you hear efficiency spoken about is how costly it is. $2.3 billion companies need to expend into this black box in order to get a single drug approved. And there's another way that people talk about it, which is in terms of time. 8.3 years to go from a first-in-human trial through to a licensed product. It's really inefficient. Imagine what we could be doing if it were only 6 years, et cetera. All that's great if you're a drug company, if you're a regulator, and maybe if you're a person, a patient. These are all reasonable ways to think about efficiency. But what I really want to focus on, I'm an ethicist, and what I really want to focus on is measures or indices of efficiency that are getting at exactly what matters morally, so that we're not distracted by issues that maybe indirectly matter, but that are not really getting at the constructs or the ideas that really matter. And to me, you can dispute this. This is just my model of efficiency. Might not be the right one, but it's the one that I use. I think a lot of this begins with the fact that when we develop drugs, we ask people with medical needs to undertake risks for future patients who don't yet have medical needs right now. They undertake those risks and they do a bit of extra work for the sake of that. And so one of the things that is going to be really crucial when we think about efficiency is how much we're asking people who have unmet medical needs to give up in order to drive the knowledge enterprise. I'll add to that really quickly that this is also true of non-human animals. This is not a non-human animal audience, so I'm not going to get into that. My book will. There's another component here, which is that we often think about the output in terms of the drugs, but in fact, drugs are just these benign compounds that sit in prescription bottles unless we know how to use them and unless we know something about the magnitude of the benefit and the risks of that. So really what we're trying to get out of that black box when we're talking about efficiency is drugs plus the evidence about how to use them and how large the effect is. Now, to be strictly speaking, even that doesn't really matter that much morally, because of course the only reason we develop drugs and evidence is because we want to convert that through healthcare systems into health, welfare for patients, which I'm just going to capture with the idea of opportunity. So ultimately, when we're talking about efficiency in a really sort of global sense, in a philosophical sense, we're talking about how much we have to ask of human beings with unmet medical needs in order to get out opportunity for future patients by way of producing drugs and evidence. Now, I want to unpack a little bit about what I mean by humans. What are they giving up? I mentioned already that there's some welfare. Patients are exposed to drugs, many of which are going to end up being abandoned. And here, when we talk about welfare, we can talk about efficiency both in terms of the intensity of what an individual might be giving up, as well as the number of individuals. So even welfare itself has to be kind of unpacked in some way. A second component that I think is not really adequately recognized in my field, but I think is an important one, is that patients, when they go into trials, they do work. They have to show up at clinics, they have to submit to procedures, they have to keep patient diaries. That's work, that's labor. They're uncompensated for that labor. And I think this also creates a certain demand that people who participate in trials have on the way we orchestrate this. The third component will resonate to some extent with what Jerome said, which is that there's always opportunity cost. When you decide to invest in testing one hypothesis, you are not investing in some other hypothesis. There's potential opportunity cost. Scientists are a scarce resource, largely a product of social investment, public education system and whatnot. So you really want to make sure that you are assigning scientists to really good projects. So those three components. There's a fourth component that I think really matters, which is that we're not just asking anyone to participate in drug development. Usually what qualifies you to participate in a drug trial is you've moved from one diagnostic category to another one, usually a worse one. And so even though I'm not using this in the traditional sense that bioethics uses it, we're talking about usually trials being run in patients who have dependency relations with healthcare systems and or the people that run them. And what's peculiar about drug development, what makes this, I think, a really sort of challenging sphere and what ups the stakes of doing this efficiently is that there's this peculiar inversion in terms of where we place the burden when we develop drugs. Normally, when we think about asking people to give something up for society, for the future, we think about asking the healthiest, the best off among us. That's what progressive taxation, that's the spirit of progressive taxation, if it existed. But what happens in medical research is exactly the reverse. Generally speaking, when you look at medical research, it's usually the disadvantaged, the most disadvantaged patients that are often the ones that are asked to make the greatest contributions, sacrifices, and welfare. Think about phase 1 studies in cancer. Patients who are the most disease refractory. These are also the studies that require the most clinic visits, so the most amount of work, and they also have the worst risk-benefit balance. Okay, so this is the model that I have of what's going on when we develop drugs, and I would say that the principle that is really not, it can be perhaps read into Belmont and SIAMS, but it's not really not explicit there. The core sort of organizing principle, how we ought to be thinking about this, is to maximize moral efficiency. So platforms often, offer sort of one really exciting way to potentially redeem or fulfill this requirement. Now, if we're going to try to maximize efficiency, we need to figure out how to intervene in a system to get it to be efficient. And here, I think it's helpful to think about drug development as akin to a machine. And this is a machine. Anyone know what this is a machine of? A picture machine? It's one of the worst machines ever created for human health. Cigarette rolling machine. But this illustration gives us a sense of what it is that makes machines machines, and I think it's going to be useful for thinking about how we want to structure drug development and how it's useful to think about drug development as a machinery. So when you look at this machine, you see that there's a lot of little parts, gears and whatnot. Those gears are organized into modules with each other, connected through belts. Those modules are organized with other modules in order to produce some kind of an output. And I think drug development and platform studies implicitly already have this idea that there's a lot of little parts that are organized, often in some kind of hierarchical structure, in order to take some input, tobacco and rolling paper, and to get some sort of output, cancer sticks. Okay, so the question is, when we look into that black box of drug development, what are the moving parts? What is the machinery of drug development? The one that takes up most of the oxygen when we talk about the ethics of research is experiments, individual clinical trials. And just to be really clear, my conception of what trials are is I view clinical trials and experiments, and I think most people view them as kind of scientific things. I view them as moral things. Basically, the way I understand what an experiment is you've got to make some decision for which there's a lot morally at stake. And you need some reason, some ground, some evidentiary ground to move forward with that decision or to retreat from that decision. And so what's going on in an experiment is you have a situation where experts are uncertain, something akin to clinical equipoise, about the veracity of a hypothesis. You run the experiment. The doubters, this is along the lines of Alex's slides, the doubters now migrate. They've seen the evidence, they update their views, they now migrate to a position where they now support moving forward from phase 2 to phase 3, from phase 3 to registration, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the gears of what's going on in drug development. Now, no one experiment gets a drug out there as a proven and safe and effective drugs. The fact is that to develop those drugs, they have to undergo a series of clinical trials, which I call trajectories. You're used to seeing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, et cetera. You can think of these as trajectories. In the same way that experiments can have inefficiencies in the way they're run, 2-to-1 randomization as an example, trajectories can have inefficiencies in the way they're orchestrated or the way they're organized. The third layer is programs. Ultimately, if you're trying to develop an ALS drug and you have ALS, you don't care whether it's Eli Lilly's drug that gets approved. You just want one safe and effective drug. So ultimately, your trajectories are going to be organized, perhaps not as well coordinated, but they're going to be organized into some set of parallel activities where the task is to get one safe and effective drug, ALS drug, out of that exercise. And again, depending on how you organize and orchestrate these programs, you can either need more patients and more welfare or less. So again, we look at this black box, we peer into it, and we see that there's a lot of experiments organized into trajectories that themselves constitute programs. And most of the vocabulary we have for thinking about risk and benefit is really geared only to the gears of this, the individual experiments, not the trajectories and programs. So now so the underlying thesis is that we ought to orchestrate this in a way that asks as little as possible from the animals and humans that we feed into this. Now, let me move on to the platform trials. What is distinctive about platform trials is that they have embedded within them, unlike traditional trials, these other components that I've described that are in the machinery of drug development. So for example, they have something like parts of programs embedded in them. You have a basket study or some kind of a platform study where you're testing a lot of early phase, preliminary efficacy studies. That sounds something like a program. So here you're going to need to think about some of the different opportunities and liabilities that you have for building all of those different individual experiments in building a program into your platform. Likewise, with studies that have these seamless designs or this graduation, now you have trajectories as well as programs that are embedded within your drug testing machinery. And again, I think that there are a lot of good opportunities, but also liabilities in terms of capitalizing on some of the ways we can make programs, trajectories, and experiments, for that matter, more efficient. I'm going to give 3 examples of a liability, an opportunity, and something where that's just completely neutral. And then I'm happy to stop and take questions. I started off with this, which is that when we use the word efficiency, we ought to have much greater clarity about exactly what we're talking about. And if we're talking about this in a moral sense, if we're trying to have a moral conversation or appeal to platform as having something morally advantageous, we should come forward with saying exactly what that is. So I would make a plea for a typology or nomenclature of efficiency and for people to use that. It's important to recognize the more you think about this, the more you begin to recognize that there's not going to be any single metric. We're going to be competing metrics, some of which of those competing metrics are going to be non-defensible. We can throw them away. Others are going to be good candidates, and it's not going to be any reason why that definition ought to have priority over another definition. So first, here's just one sort of simple definition we might use. How much information are you getting per patient? If you run a study that's overpowered, you're getting less information per patient than if you study that's appropriate power. But you can also think about fairly simple definitions like this. What fraction of drugs are graduated on a per patient basis? You can also think about denominators like time as being something, time being a proxy for opportunity cost, as an example. You can also move to more sophisticated attempts to, to try to kind of develop metrics of efficiency or vocabulary of efficiency. You might say, well, patience and time both matter. Maybe we care more about the patients for the following reasons than we do about the time. So therefore, we weight patients more heavily when we think about the advantages of platform studies, et cetera. And finally, there are other kinds of metrics of efficiency that I think matter morally, but that might not sort of fit into the kind of framing that the first 4 come in. So for example, you can imagine programs, you can imagine platforms that are changing if the results of platform studies are used for registration. You can imagine how they could alter the error probability of approval, right? Drugs get approved that turn out to be ineffective all the time. It doesn't happen very commonly. But there are all sorts of reasons to think that if you intervene earlier in the drug development process, or if you use different kinds of tools for those confirmatory studies, you also are going to change the error rates for your approval. So one of the other kinds of efficiencies you can start to think about is, what fraction of truly effective drugs are coming out of these platform studies per the drugs that are graduated per the drugs that graduate across that threshold that get approval. Okay, so that's my first pitch is, let's maybe get a little bit more clarity. To my mind, as a shorthand, I'm usually thinking, again, this is just a shorthand of the number of patients you need to get to a point where you can shift community either for or against using an intervention. Here's a second idea for, there's lots of possibilities, ways to exploit platforms. I'm going to throw out one that I've never seen people talk about. Maybe the statisticians in here will tell me this is completely wrong, but I'll lay it out. Let's take a condition like ALS or cancer. When you're developing drugs, you may have drugs that are in different classes. So one class of drugs here indicated in red, one class in gray, one class in yellow. I would argue that what we really care most about is minimizing error within a drug class as opposed to individual drugs. So right now, when we develop drugs, we power each of those trials more or less the same, regardless of whether they're in a crowded drug class or in a drug class that's not powered. But I would argue that patients get much more from having multiple drugs that are in different classes approved than they do from getting multiple drugs that are within the same class. And so again, this is something that potentially you can exploit within a platform study by assigning different kinds of statistical properties, for example, different powering to drugs based on whether they are members of a crowded class or whether they're members from a less crowded class. Maybe drug companies won't like that, but again, if our goal of efficiency is to create opportunity for future patients as opposed to shareholders, then this seems like something that's really relevant to do. Let me close with a point that I think came up in the word grams that has always puzzled me why it's not discussed more in the context of platform, and for that matter, adaptive studies. So I've done a lot of work on forecasting, and there's some great literature, if you go dig into the forecasting literature from the 1950s about like what's a good weather forecast. And one of my favorite articles, they lay out 6 or 7 properties of what a good forecast is. And the 7th property in this paper is, well, a good forecast is a forecast that the users can interpret in a valid way. And I often feel like medicine could learn a lot from this forecasting literature because medicine often uses metrics that are extremely difficult to interpret. A good example of this is hazard ratios. I don't really understand hazard ratios. I would venture to say that probably 95% of cancer doctors don't really understand how to interpret hazard ratios. But that's the standard that is used when you pick up New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA. If your goal is to align practice with evidence, you probably want a metric that is either going to be more intuitive to oncologists, or you're going to need to invest much more in training them how to think about that. And I think scrutability really raises some challenges with platform studies. They're incredibly complex. They're incredibly opaque. When you write a scientific paper, this is not a criticism, it's just an observation. When you read a scientific publication, any platform, non-platform, the method section is a distillation of what was done in that study. And with platform studies, you have assumptions that are derived from modeling, perhaps some elicitation. There's just layers and layers that go into the design of a platform study such that a reader of that trial is going to have a hard time knowing how much they believe it or how much they don't. I thought about this the first time I read the first study of the CAP remap. Is it remap CAP or CAP remap? I always forget them confused. I'm trial dyslexic. They used borrowing. They were testing 2 drugs that were, I believe they were both IL-6 inhibitors, but they were borrowing so that in the end result, they declared one of the drugs effective, partly based on data from the other drug. I'm not a pharmacologist. I don't know, like how similar was that other drug? How sound was the borrowing assumption? I have no idea, but I read that trial and I thought, I don't really know what to make of this trial. I hope other people do. And so maybe people do, but I do think that if platforms are truly going to be able to be efficient, where I define efficiency as aligning here expert belief with where the evidence is so they can make good decisions. Yeah, I'm on my last minute. This is my concluding sentence here. That it's going to be crucial for their scrutability, for the kinds of metrics and outputs to be front-loaded into the way we design as opposed to an afterthought. With that, I conclude my remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for a really interesting and thought-provoking talk. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Jonathan. That was fascinating. So can you briefly elaborate on the principle of maximizing moral efficiency. I probably missed it or didn't quite catch why moral was in there, because you also mentioned a couple of other criteria like labor and vulnerability. Is it a trade-off between all these principles, or is it something different?
Yeah. It's in a sense, the idea of moral efficiency, it's a blank slate. Okay. I'm saying there are these 5 different things that are probably capturing much of what matters when we talk about moral efficiency. And that in principle, we would want to minimize the amount of welfare that we put into drug development to get drugs and opportunity out. We'd want to minimize the vulnerability of the patients we include. We'd want to minimize the amount of work patients have to do. So each of those different components is going to be part of moral efficiency. Now, you are probably thinking, oh, well, some of those things may be in tension with each other. Maybe that you can run larger trials that are a little bit less invasive for patients. How does moral efficiency handle that? And the answer is, I don't know. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. This is a classic moral problem where different people are going to have different interpretations. But the point is that there are a set of items that we consider to be morally significant that are in some sense measurable, or at least we can speak about them as having some kind of ordinal properties. And we ought to do our best to design not just the experiments, but the trajectories and the programs in a way that asks the least from that. And truly, like when I put up this concept of efficiency, I'm giving you my interpretation of it, but it's really an invitation for others to derive their definitions and to defend them.
Yeah, Alex.
So I'd like to go back to scrutability, because it isn't that I disagree with you, but like in the setup that you have where you've got trajectories and individual studies, trajectories of studies, families of trajectories of studies, and we want to try to minimize then patient burden and all this other stuff across the families of trajectories of studies. Aren't you going to run into basically the same problem that platform trials endogenize? I mean, in order to make sense across those different things, you're going to have to figure out what's similar to what, and you're going to have lots of complex comparisons. And so, like, how does your problem avoid the problem of scrutability, or is it just endemic to trying to be more efficient in general?
Well, I mean, number one, I would say, I used the example of hazard ratios. You don't need to be in a platform study to note that the standard metric used in cancer is very statistically convenient, but very hard to interpret for people who are non-statisticians. So that's just a general statement. But I think in the case of platform studies, if you have, I would venture to say, and you can tell me if you think this is implausible, that Joe Doctor, who has done a fellowship and has a certain amount of savvy reading the literature, presented with a publication that came out of a platform study versus one that came out of a standard parallel arm dinosaur trial, is probably going to have a little bit more confidence in knowing how much they believe the result and how to interpret the result. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that, and that derives from the I think, accurate inference that the platform one is a lot more complicated and has a lot more assumptions that are built into it, and they don't have an opinion on those assumptions. They can't even tell what those assumptions are. So all I'm saying is that's not a killer for platform studies. That's not a reason not to do them. But I'm saying that if you want platform studies to take patient welfare and convert it into expert belief that's accurate, you need to sort of front load or think about the communication strategies and build those into the platform studies.
Tom.
On your, just a quick question on the first topic, on the WHO thing. Have you looked at the output of EU Pearl?
So we never do systematic reviews of literature before we start working on a research problem, because, no, I'm just joking. Yes, the answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, it's early in the process, and so I will confess to not having read 3 times that paper. The one paper I'm thinking of in particular, Nguyen et al., just to show you that I know which paper, at least one of them. But anyway, through the process, for sure, we want to make sure to draw on the insights, and especially that's a really interesting one because there's so many different stakeholders that are coming at it. It's actually an interesting, because I'll just say one thing about that. The one article that I'm thinking of, there might be multiple articles, but the actual ethics content in that article is real. There's only like, if you do a search for the word ethics, it only comes up 3 or 4 times. Most of the time saying we need to do more ethics in this. So there's actually, yeah, but it's an interesting initiative and very helpful.
Yeah, Mark.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. So, I mean, perhaps not for now, I have a quibble about the idea of moral efficiency and whether that's going to depict what you're trying to get at in the right kind of way. But the question I really wanted to ask you, I think it's more interesting, I hope, is you started with the machine. And I think the machine idea and taking in the breadth of development and all of the process looks really good. And it's really important. But I guess, so the question is, when you parceled out the box and you put the platform in it, there's a question about why the box is there and why it looks like that, rather than, I mean, it could go back a little bit to include early phase things, or it could go forward to include, HTA evidence, that sort of approval sort of process. Or you could you could divide it up. Just thinking about how they made the machine.
Yeah.
Is there is there a sort of a rationale behind that? Because it's arbitrary.
Yeah. Thanks. So there is number one, there's a rationale, and number two, obviously because of the brevity of the talk, I could give a whole talk about just that box. So I actually I include basic research in that box, and I also include post-approval research. So I actually think we've got a system, a whole system. And there are certain moral properties that ought to be maintained across that entire system. And moral efficiency was one of them. We should use as few animals as possible. We should kill as few mice as possible to get to the point of a phase 1 study. So, okay. So to specifically, look, you're a philosopher, so you know that, nature isn't cut at the joints or something like that, right? So, how do we create these categories? Like, why am I parsing this up in a way? I view this as kind of a pragmatic undertaking. For me, I'm not making some kind of ontological claim that there are these things that are out there in the world of drug development. I'm saying if we want to get traction on what matters morally, this is a very convenient way to break up these combinations of activities. And that's really the criteria that I'm using for how I parcel things out.
Great. I think we have time for one last question from John.
You may give a similar answer to this one. I was thinking about the class effects thing, because that seems quite interesting, but also quite hard, because the more you think about it, what do you mean by a drug class? There are things which you say are in the same drug class, have different side effect profiles in different people, and so on. So it feels tricky, but important to think through. But it also feels like if you start adding too many things into what you're considering, it all gets quite hard. So maybe you should be considering whether or not this bit of this particular arm is going to test the amyloid hypothesis, which has all these downstream consequences, is important for all these other. So it's just like, I don't know how you do that in practice. You get thoughts on it?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, yeah, I've had the exact same thought listening to many of the talks this morning. Like, okay, like you can make it even more complex to do this thing, and you can add this thing. It's like, okay, like at what point is it like, let's just, like at what point do you just say, let's just do I'll take the second most expensive one instead of the most expensive one. So yeah, and I don't have any answers. That you guys can figure that out. I'm just all I'm trying to do is sort of articulate the moral dynamics and say what's at stake, and we can sort of think through, how to think them through. I think the class effects one is interesting. So there are some people who say, oh, we shouldn't have Me Too. We should never have Me Too drugs. Obviously that's not true. You get value from having multiple drugs in a class. If Trump decides to put tariffs on one drug that comes out of the United States, it's good for other countries to be able to buy another drug in a different class that's made in a different country. So that just as one example. But I do think that, this just comes straight. The Bayesians will love this. I think. This is just a straight point. Like if you have two molecules and they have very similar properties, and they are purporting to be intervening on the same mechanism, when you run a trial on one, you're getting information about the outcome if you were to run the other trial in a similar way, right? And that's, I gather that's what Bayesians and biostatisticians mean when they talk about borrowing. What that means is you're getting less information per patient for those two trials. And so at least what I'm saying is that you can, you want to be sort of mindful to, and that's part of what platforms trials are trying to do, to sort of make sure that you're, design the study, design the analyses, et cetera, so you're getting the most amount of information per patient. And, the error thing is another component of that, but yeah.
Great, let's thank